November 3rd, 1993. Carlos Mendoza had been point man for Task Force Medellin for 18 months. The gringo the locals called El Lobo because he spoke perfect Spanish and moved through the barrios like smoke. That night, 12 DEA operatives marched into Comuna 13 to arrest Pablo Escobar's money launderer. Carlos was supposed to lead them out. Instead, he heard the first gunshot, saw muzzle flashes lighting up the narrow alley like lightning, and ran. He left 11 men to die in that concrete maze while he crawled through sewage to reach the extraction point. For 30 years, the official report said Escobar's sicarios killed the team. For 30 years, Carlos carried that lie like a stone in his chest. But yesterday, his phone rang, a voice from the grave. The one man who survived that night, calling to tell Carlos the truth about who really pulled those triggers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hook. Carlos stared at the grease under his fingernails. The phone still warm against his ear, though the line had gone dead 10 minutes ago. The voice had been older, rougher, but unmistakable. Javier Flaco Herrera, the 13-year-old street kid who'd been running messages for the local dealers that night in Comuna 13. The boy who'd seen everything from a rooftop perch, too terrified to move as gunfire erupted below. The boy who was supposed to be dead. Señor Carlos, I know what really happened that night. And I know you've been living with the wrong guilt. The Arizona sun beat down on the cracked asphalt of Mendoza Auto Repair, but Carlos felt the chill of Bogota mountains in his bones. He'd built this life deliberately, predictable, quiet, invisible. Oil changes and brake jobs. Beer after work at Miguel's Cantina. Sunday Mass at San Jose, though God knew he'd stopped listening for forgiveness years ago. His hands shook as he reached for the bottle of Herradura hidden behind the transmission fluid. 3 fingers, neat. The tequila burned, but not enough to chase away Flaco's words. They weren't wearing Escobar's colors, hermano. They were wearing DEA vests. Friendly fire, blue on blue. The nightmare scenario every operator feared more than cartel bullets. Except Flaco had said something else. Something that made Carlos's blood turn to ice water. Your partner, the tall one with the scar on his chin, he was giving orders to the shooters. Marcus Kane, Carlos's handler, his mentor, the man who'd recruited him out of Border Patrol and taught him to navigate Colombia's labyrinth of violence and corruption. Kane, who'd written the after-action report that painted Carlos as the sole survivor of a sicario ambush. Kane, who'd recommended Carlos for a Purple Heart and early retirement with full pension. Kane, who'd apparently orchestrated the murder of 11 federal agents. The shop bell chimed. Carlos palmed the bottle, muscle memory kicking in as his eyes swept the entrance. Desert wind carried dust devils across the lot, but no vehicles approached. Paranoia, another gift from his DEA years. Carlos? A woman's voice, familiar but unexpected. Maria stepped through the doorway, silhouetted against the blazing afternoon. His daughter, 28 now, wearing a prosecutor's confidence like armor. Her dark hair pulled back severely, the way her mother used to wear it during arguments. They'd spoken maybe a dozen times since Elena's funeral 5 years ago. Mija. He stood slowly, wiping his hands on a shop rag. What brings you to... I need to ask you about Colombia. Her voice carried the prosecutorial edge that had made her famous for dismantling money laundering operations across 3 states. About what really happened in Medellin. The tequila turned to acid in his stomach. Coincidences didn't exist in his world. First Flaco's call, now Maria asking questions about ghosts that should have stayed buried. That's ancient history, mija. Why are you... Because Marcus Kane is dead. She stepped closer, and he saw something in her eyes he'd rarely witnessed. Fear. Murdered 3 nights ago in his Malibu beach house. Professional job. 2 bullets to the head, no prints, no witnesses. And before you ask how I know, I've been building a RICO case against his import-export business for 8 months. The shop tilted sideways. Kane dead. The man who'd shaped him, betrayed him, and apparently saved his life by leaving him out of whatever scheme had gotten 11 good men killed. The FBI thinks it's cartel retaliation, Maria continued. But Kane's financial records show wire transfers to numbered accounts in the Caymans. Millions of dollars, Carlos, dating back 30 years, starting 3 weeks after your team was killed in Comuna 13. Carlos set down the rag carefully. His daughter had inherited her mother's intelligence and his own stubborn refusal to let sleeping dogs lie. Dangerous combination. What exactly are you asking me? I'm asking if you knew your partner was dirty. I'm asking if you ran that night because you were scared or because you were involved. She paused, studying his face with a prosecutor's intensity. And I'm asking because someone broke into my apartment last night. They didn't take anything, Carlos. They left a message. She pulled out her phone, showed him a photo. Words carved into her coffee table in precise block letters. Some secrets should stay buried. The familiar weight of the Glock. 19 pressed against his spine, hidden beneath his work shirt. Old habits. He'd been carrying for 30 years, even though Tucson's biggest threats usually involved drunk college kids and the occasional tweaker looking to steal copper wire. But this wasn't about Tucson anymore. Pack a bag, mija. Stay at the Marriott downtown until… No. Maria's jaw set in that stubborn line he remembered from her teenage years. I'm not running from this. If Kane was dirty, if your team was murdered by their own people, then someone needs to pay. Those 11 men had families, Carlos. They deserve justice. Outside, a black SUV rolled slowly past the shop. Tinted windows, California plates. It didn't stop, but Carlos caught the profile of the driver. Lean, angular, familiar. After 30 years, the past had finally come hunting. Carlos watched the SUV disappear around the corner, its brake lights flaring once before vanishing into Tucson's heat shimmer. The familiar profile gnawed at him, someone from the old days, maybe. Or maybe paranoia was finally eating what was left of his sanity. You're scaring me, old man. Maria's voice cut through his surveillance sweep. She'd moved closer to the shop's entrance, positioning herself where she could see both directions down Valencia Road. Prosecutor's instincts, but also his daughter. Some lessons stuck whether you wanted them to or not. The afternoon light caught the silver chain at her throat. Elena's cross, the one she'd worn through 20 years of marriage to a man who disappeared for months at a time chasing ghosts through South America. Carlos had given it to Maria after the funeral, surprised she'd kept it. Surprised she'd come here at all. When's the last time we talked, Mia? Really talked? He pulled 2 folding chairs from behind the parts counter, gestured toward the shade cast by a rusted Camaro he'd been meaning to fix for 3 years. Before your mother died, I mean. Maria hesitated, then sat. Her heels clicked against the concrete, expensive shoes that looked wrong in his world of oil stains and desert dust. Christmas, 2018 maybe? You came to Phoenix for dinner. Lasted about an hour before you started making excuses. He remembered. Elena had cooked tamales, Maria's favorite since childhood. They'd sat around a table in her apartment. Clean, orderly, nothing like the chaos of her teenage years when every surface collected law books and case files. She'd gotten that from him, too. The need to understand things completely, to pick apart every detail until the truth bled through. I wasn't good at being a father. The words came easier than expected. Even worse at being a grandfather. Sophia's 5 now. She asks about you sometimes. Maria pulled out her phone, swiped to a photo. A little girl with Elena's eyes and Maria's stubborn chin, gap-toothed grin beneath unruly dark curls. She wants to know why her abuelo fixes cars instead of coming to her birthday parties. The sight hit harder than expected. 5 years old. Elena had lived long enough to hold her once, right after Maria's difficult pregnancy. Carlos had been in the hospital room for maybe 10 minutes before the walls started closing in, the need to escape overwhelming everything else. I don't know how to be around kids anymore. He studied his hands, the permanent grease under his nails, the scar across his left palm from a cartel knife in Cartagena. Too much baggage, mija. Too many things I can't talk about. Then talk about them now. Maria leaned forward, and he caught a whiff of her perfume, something expensive and clean that reminded him painfully of Elena getting ready for church. Because if Kane was dirty, if those men died because of something you were involved in. I wasn't involved. The words came out harder than intended. Whatever Kane did, whatever money he stole, I didn't know. I was the company man. following orders, trusting my handler like they taught us at Quantico. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals above the Santa Catalina Mountains. Carlos had always loved this view. Desert stretching toward purple peaks, sky so big it made Colombia's mountains feel claustrophobic. He'd chosen Tucson deliberately, far from beaches and jungles, from anywhere memories could ambush him. The night it happened, he said slowly, we were supposed to be gathering intelligence on Escobar's money laundering operation. Kane had a source, someone deep inside the organization who could give us account numbers, transaction records, the kind of intelligence that could bring down the whole network. Maria pulled out a small recorder, set it between them. Can I? Carlos stared at the device. 30 years of silence, and his daughter wanted it on the record. This doesn't leave here, not yet. Understood. He pressed play himself, the click, loud in the desert quiet. We went in light, 12 men, minimal equipment. Kane said stealth was more important than firepower, said we'd be in and out before the sicarios knew we were there. He paused, remembering the weight of his M4, the way sweat had pooled under his tactical vest in Medellin's humidity. I was point man. First one into the compound. What went wrong? Everything. Carlos closed his eyes, and suddenly he was back there. Muzzle flashes in the darkness, the distinctive crack of AK-47s, screams in Spanish and English, mixing with the rattle of automatic weapons. We walked into a kill box, perfect positioning, overlapping fields of fire. Like they knew exactly where we'd be. How did you get out? The question he'd been asking himself for 15 years. Why him? Why was Carlos Mendoza the only man to walk away from that slaughter? I ran. The admission tasted like copper and shame. Heard Kane on the radio calling for extraction, saw my teammates going down, and I ran like a coward. The hawk screamed overhead, a harsh cry that echoed off the mountains. Maria's phone buzzed against the metal table between them, the vibration sharp in the desert silence. She glanced at the screen, frowned, then looked again. The color drained from her face. Unknown number, she said, but her thumb was already moving toward the answer button. Don't Carlos reached across the table, but she'd already swiped to accept the call. Maria Mendoza. Her prosecutor voice, clipped and professional, but Carlos could see the tremor in her free hand. He couldn't hear the voice on the other end, but he watched his daughter's expression shift from wariness to confusion to something approaching terror. The phone slipped in her grip. What do you mean you have? She stopped, listening. Her eyes found Carlos's, wide with panic. No, that's impossible. She's at school. She's supposed to be. Carlos was already moving, crossing the space between them in 2 strides. He could hear the voice now, distorted through the phone's speaker, heavily accented English, the careful pronunciation of someone who'd learned the language in prison or war. The little girl with the gap in her teeth, see? Very pretty. Looks like her abuela, Sofia. Maria's voice cracked. Where is she? What have you done with? She is safe, for now. But that depends very much on what happens next, Senora Prosecutor. Carlos's blood turned to ice water. He'd spent 15 years believing the past was buried, that his exile in Arizona had bought him peace. But you didn't run from men like this. You only postponed the reckoning. I'll give you anything, Maria was saying. Money, information, whatever you want. What I want is very simple. The voice carried the flat menace of a man who'd killed before and would again. I want El Lobo to come home. The childhood nickname hit like a physical blow. Wolf. They'd called him that in Colombia because of how he moved through the jungle, silent, patient, deadly when cornered. Only his team had known that name, his team and Marcus Kane. Carlos gestured for the phone. Maria hesitated, then handed it over with shaking fingers. This is Mendoza. Ah, the famous survivor. We meet again, hermano. The voice triggered something deep in Carlos's memory. Not recent, but old. Comuna 13 old. He closed his eyes, sorting through faces from that night, trying to match the accent to a source. Who is this? Someone you left behind. Someone who remembers how quickly El Lobo abandoned his pack. A pause, then a sound that might have been laughter. But we can discuss old times when you arrive. You have 72 hours to reach Medellin. Come alone, come unarmed, and bring what your partner stole from us. I don't know what Kane. 72 horas, Lobo, or the little girl learns what happened to her grandfather's friends. The line went dead. Carlos stared at the phone, his reflection distorted in the black screen. Behind that reflection, he could see Maria watching him with a mixture of fear and something else, the dawning realization that her father wasn't who she'd thought he was. They have Sophia. Her voice was barely a whisper. My 5-year-old daughter. They have my baby because of you. The words hit harder than any bullet he'd taken. Carlos set the phone down carefully, his hands steady despite the earthquake happening inside his chest. 30 years of hiding, and it had all been for nothing. The past had found him anyway, and now it was coming for the only people he had left. I need to make some calls, he said quietly. Find out who has her, where they're holding her. You need to tell me the truth. Maria stood abruptly, her chair scraping against concrete. All of it. No more half-stories, no more protecting me from whatever you think I can't handle. They took my daughter because of something you did, something you know, so talk. Carlos looked at his hands again, at the permanent grease and scars and calluses that marked 30 years of trying to become someone else. But you couldn't change what you were born to be. And he'd been born to hunt in dark places, to track predators through jungles of concrete and corruption. The man on the phone had made one critical mistake. He'd threatened the wrong family. You're right, Carlos said, reaching under his work shirt for the Glock he'd carried every day for 3 decades. I ran that night, but not because I was scared. He checked the magazine, chambered around. I ran because someone I trusted put a gun to my head and told me to. The desert wind picked up, scattering dust across the shop floor. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, police or ambulance, the everyday emergencies of a world that had no idea how quickly everything could change. Carlos's old life was officially over. Time to remember how to be the wolf. Maria stared at the gun in her father's hands like it was a venomous snake. Put that away. We're calling the FBI. This is a kidnapping. There are protocols, procedures. No. Carlos ejected the magazine, checked the rounds, slammed it home with practiced efficiency. You involve the feds, Sophia dies. These aren't street criminals, mija. They're professionals. Then what? You fly to Colombia and get yourself killed? She paced between the workbenches, her heels clicking in agitated rhythm. That's your plan? Leave me with no father and no daughter? Carlos wanted to tell her she'd been without a father for years anyway, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he pulled his cell phone from his pocket, scrolled through contacts he hadn't called in decades. Most were probably dead by now. The drug war had a way of consuming everyone who touched it. He found the number he was looking for, Tommy Vega. Last he'd heard, Tommy was running private security out of Miami, specializing in executive protection for companies with interests in Latin America, the kind of work that required connections on both sides of the law. What are you doing? Calling in old debts. The phone rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. Whoever this is, it better be good. I'm in the middle of... It's Carlos Mendoza. Silence stretched across the connection. Carlos could picture Tommy. Stocky, bearded, the kind of man who looked like a bouncer but thought like a chess master. They'd worked together in Guatemala, hunting MS-13 smuggling routes through the jungle. Jesus Christ, Carlos, where the hell have you been? Tucson, lying low. Listen, I need information. Hold up. Tommy's voice dropped to a whisper. This line secure? Carlos glanced at Maria, who was watching him with the intensity of a prosecutor dissecting testimony. Secure enough. I need to know about Marcus Kane's operation, who he was working with, what he was moving. Another pause. When Tommy spoke again, his words carried the careful weight of a man choosing between loyalty and survival. Carlos, man, you don't want to go down that road. Kane's people, they're not the same as the old cartels. They're businessmen now, corporate, and they don't forgive. Someone took my granddaughter. Fuck. Tommy exhaled slowly. How long ago? Today, maybe an hour. Carlos checked his watch, 4:47 p.m. Time was already slipping away. They want me in Medellin, 72 hours. Carlos, listen to me very carefully. Kane wasn't just dirty, he was connected. High-level protection, people in justice, treasury, maybe higher. When he got killed 3 days ago, it sent shockwaves through half the smuggling operations on the West Coast. Maria had stopped pacing. She stood beside the workbench now, close enough to hear Tommy's side of the conversation. Who killed him? Nobody knows for sure. But word is, it was someone from the old days. Someone with a long memory and a longer grudge. Tommy paused. Look, I'll make some calls, see what I can find out about your situation. But Carlos, if they took your family, it's not random. This is personal. The line went dead. Carlos stared at the phone, pieces of a 30-year-old puzzle starting to fall into place. Cain's death, Maria's investigation, now Sophia's kidnapping, all connected by threads he was just beginning to see. Dad! Maria's voice was softer now, the prosecutor's edge replaced by something more vulnerable. When you said Cain put a gun to your head, what did you mean? Carlos holstered the Glock, but kept his hand near it. Old habits. After the shooting started, after I saw our men going down, I tried to call for backup. Cain stopped me, said the operation was blown, that calling in support would just get more people killed. But that's not all. No, the memory came back in fragments, muzzle flashes, screaming, the metallic taste of fear. He gave me a choice. Take the blame for the failed mission, accept a medical discharge, disappear quietly, or stay and answer questions about why I was the only survivor. Maria absorbed this, her legal mind working through the implications. He was threatening to frame you. Or worse, men like Cain don't make idle threats. Carlos walked to the shop's front window, scanned the street. No black SUVs, but that didn't mean they weren't being watched. I took his deal because I was young and scared and wanted to believe my mentor was protecting me. Now I think he was protecting himself. The sun was beginning to sink toward the mountains, painting the desert in shades of copper and gold. In a few hours it would be dark, and darkness belonged to hunters. Carlos had spent 30 years trying to forget that lesson, but some instincts never died. Behind him, Maria made a sound that might have been a sob. When he turned, she was holding her phone, staring at the lock screen photo, Sophia's gap-toothed smile. They're going to kill her, aren't they? Not if I get there first. Middle development. Carlos moved toward the back of the shop, Maria following close behind. He knelt beside an old tool cabinet, pulled out the bottom drawer completely, and reached into the hollow space behind it. His fingers found the metal lockbox he'd hoped never to open again. What is that? Maria's voice carried a tremor she couldn't quite hide. Insurance. Carlos entered a combination he'd memorized 15 years ago but never used. The lock clicked open. Inside, 3 passports, each with his photo but different names, stacks of cash in various currencies, and a single manila envelope, its edges yellowed with age. He hesitated before touching the envelope. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. After Cain forced me out, I kept digging, quietly, called in favors, traced financial records, followed paper trails. He lifted the envelope, surprised by how light it felt for something that had cost him everything. I found out what really happened that night in Comuna 13. Maria crouched beside him. This close, he could see the worry lines around her eyes, the way she bit her lower lip when stressed. Elena's habit passed down. What did you find? Carlos opened the envelope, spread photographs across the concrete floor. Bank statements, transfer records, surveillance photos of Cain meeting with men in expensive suits. The careful documentation of betrayal. The operation wasn't about gathering intelligence. It was about stealing $43 million in cartel money that was being moved through a shell company. He pointed to a transfer record. Cain wasn't hunting Escobar's people. He was robbing them. And the 11 men who died? Witnesses, the only people who knew about the real mission. Carlos's throat felt dry, the words scraping like sand. Cain set them up, fed information to the sicarios, made sure they'd be in the right place at the right time. Maria studied the photographs with her prosecutor's eye, but Carlos could see the moment understanding hit her. The slight widening of her eyes, the way her shoulders tensed. You knew all this. For 15 years you've known Cain murdered your team, and you never said anything. I tried. The lie came automatically, then crumbled under his daughter's stare. No, that's not true. I gathered the evidence, and then I buried it. Why? The question he'd asked himself 1,000 times. Carlos gathered the photos, his hands moving with automatic precision. But his mind was back in that hospital room in Bogota, Cain sitting beside his bed like a concerned mentor. "You have two choices, son. You can try to be a hero, accuse a decorated DEA supervisor of murder based on evidence that will disappear the moment you speak up, or you can take your medical discharge, accept that sometimes good men die for bad reasons, and build a life somewhere else." "Because I was 28 years old and scared," Carlos said quietly. "Because Cain showed me photographs of other agents who'd asked inconvenient questions. Car accidents, home invasions, training exercises that went wrong." He stood, knees protesting after too many years bent over car engines. "Because I convinced myself that exposing him wouldn't bring those men back, but it would get me killed. So you took the money and ran." "I took enough to disappear. The rest," Carlos gestured to the financial records. "Cain built an empire with it. Shipping routes from Cartagena to Long Beach, political connections that reached Washington. By the time I understood the scope of what he'd created, I was just one old mechanic with a box of papers nobody would believe." Maria was quiet for a long moment, studying the lock screen photo of Sofia. The families of those 11 men, they never knew what really happened. No, they thought their fathers and husbands died as heroes, fighting cartels. Yes, while you've been hiding in the desert, fixing cars, and their killer became rich. Each word was a blade. Carlos had spent 30 years trying to justify his silence, to convince himself that exposure would only create more victims. But sitting here with his daughter, looking at evidence of Cain's crimes spread across oil-stained concrete, the justifications felt paper-thin. "The man who called," Maria continued, "he said he was someone you left behind. Someone who remembers." Carlos nodded slowly. The accent, the familiarity with his old nickname, the personal rage beneath the professional threat, pieces clicking into place. "I think it might be Javier Restrepo. He was our translator, our local contact. 19 years old, smart kid who wanted to be a cop. Was he there that night? He was supposed to meet us at the extraction point. When I stumbled out of that compound covered in my teammates' blood, he was waiting with a jeep." The memory surfaced like something dragged up from deep water. "I never told him what really happened, just that we'd been betrayed, that he needed to disappear before Cain's people came looking for loose ends. And now he has Sofia." Carlos closed the lockbox but left the photographs visible. 30 years of silence, and it had bought him nothing except the illusion of safety. Now that illusion was dead, and his granddaughter was paying the price for his cowardice. The desert wind picked up again, rattling the shop's metal walls. Somewhere out there, a 5-year-old girl was wondering why strangers had taken her from school, why nobody was coming to help. Time to stop running. Plot twist. Carlos's phone rang again as he was putting the lockbox away. Unknown number, but he recognized the pattern now. Encrypted, bounced through multiple towers. Professional paranoia that mirrored his own. Mendoza. "I hope you're making travel arrangements, Lobo." The same voice, but something different in the tone. Less menace, more satisfaction. "I'm coming, but I want proof my granddaughter is safe." "Of course." A reasonable request. The line went quiet, then Carlos heard movement, a door opening. "Sofia, say hello to your abuelo." "Grandpa Carlos?" The small voice hit him like a physical blow. Scared but trying to be brave, the way Elena had taught her. "I want to go home. These men say they know you. I'm coming to get you, mija. Be strong for me, okay?" "Okay." A pause, then Sofia's voice dropped to a whisper. "Grandpa, the man with the scar, he says to tell you that Marcus Cain sends his regards." The phone was pulled away before Carlos could respond. Javier's voice returned, but now Carlos could hear the smile in it. An interesting message. "No? Cain's dead. Tommy told me." "Your friend Tommy tells you many things, but perhaps not everything." The line crackled with static. "Tell me, Carlos, in all your years of hiding, did you ever wonder who gave Cain the information about your investigation? Who warned him that you were gathering evidence?" Carlos felt the world tilt slightly. "What are you talking about?" The photographs in your lockbox, the bank records, the careful documentation of betrayal. Javier's voice carried the patient tone of a teacher explaining something to a slow student. Who did you think told Kane exactly what evidence you had collected? The shop felt suddenly too small, too close. Carlos looked at Maria, who was watching him with growing alarm. That's impossible. Only one person knew about the investigation. See, only one person. Tommy would never. Tommy Vega, your old partner from Guatemala, your trusted friend who just happened to be in Miami when you needed information about Kane's operations. The satisfaction in Javier's voice was unmistakable now. The same Tommy Vega who has been Kane's silent partner for 30 years. The photographs scattered across the floor suddenly looked different. Carlos knelt beside them, his hands shaking as he picked up a surveillance photo of Kane meeting with associates. In the background, barely visible but unmistakably there, stood a younger Tommy Vega. You see it now, Javier continued. The careful way he guided your investigation, making sure you found evidence of Kane's crimes, but never the full scope of the operation, never the names of his real partners. Carlos's memory rewound 30 years. Tommy appearing in Guatemala just as Carlos was getting too close to MS-13's financial networks. Tommy suggesting they focus on Kane, the obvious target. Tommy helping him gather just enough evidence to be dangerous, but not enough to be effective. He's been watching you all these years, Javier said, making sure you stayed quiet, stayed hidden. Your old friend has been very protective of his investment. Maria grabbed the scattered photos, studying them with fresh eyes. Dad, this surveillance photo, look at the date stamp. This was taken 6 months after you supposedly started investigating Kane. The timeline collapsed like a house of cards. Carlos had thought he was hunting Kane, but he'd been guided, manipulated, fed information that Tommy wanted him to find. The investigation had never been his idea at all. Kane's death 3 days ago, Carlos said, pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. Tommy ordered it. Kane was becoming careless, too visible, too many questions from federal prosecutors. Javier's voice carried genuine admiration. So Tommy arranged for his old partner to have an unfortunate accident. Very clean, very professional, and now he's cleaning up loose ends. You were supposed to be easy, the broken-down mechanic with 30 years of secrets. Tommy expected you to simply disappear rather than risk exposure. A pause. But then your daughter started asking inconvenient questions about Kane's finances, following money trails that led too close to certain Miami-based security companies. Carlos looked at Maria, saw the moment understanding hit her. My prosecution of the Kane investigation. I've been targeting his money laundering operations without realizing that you were hunting the wrong man. Yes, Javier's laugh held no humor. Tommy panicked, kidnapping the prosecutor's child, forcing her father to surface. It reeks of desperation, not the careful planning that built a 30-year empire. The desert wind rattled the shop's walls again, but now it sounded like approaching thunder. Carlos stood slowly, the weight of 30 years of manipulation settling on his shoulders. The arrogant fool thinks he can control everyone, Javier continued, his voice soft with old rage. But he made one mistake, hermano. He believed his own legend. He forgot that wolves remember who hurt the pack. The line went dead, leaving Carlos staring at photographs that had just rewritten everything he thought he knew about his life. The phone slipped from Carlos's fingers, clattering against the concrete floor like a gunshot in the silence. 30 years of carefully constructed reality crumbled around him, each revelation hitting like a physical blow. Tommy Vega, his partner, his friend, the man he'd trusted with his life in the jungles of Guatemala, had been pulling the strings all along. Maria's voice cut through the static in his head. Dad? What just happened? Carlos stared at the scattered photographs, seeing them with new eyes. Every piece of evidence he'd thought was his own discovery had been a breadcrumb, carefully placed to lead him down a path Tommy had chosen. The bank records, the surveillance photos, even the timing of his investigation, all orchestrated. 30 years, he whispered, his voice cracking. 30 years of thinking I was a coward when I was just a puppet. Maria knelt beside him, gathering the photographs with methodical precision. The prosecutor in her was already working, reorganizing the evidence, seeing the new pattern. If this Javier is telling the truth, then Tommy orchestrated everything. The massacre in Comuna 13, your exile, even Cain's death. Carlos felt something breaking inside his chest. Not his heart, but the careful walls he'd built around the guilt and shame. All those sleepless nights, all those years of self-hatred, believing he'd been too weak to seek justice for 11 dead men, when in reality, he'd been a chess piece in Tommy's game from the beginning. The families, he said, standing abruptly. His legs felt unsteady, as if the shop floor had tilted. All those widows and children, thinking their men died as heroes. While I lived with the guilt of being the only survivor, you couldn't have known. I should have known. The words exploded out of him, 30 years of suppressed rage finally finding a target. Tommy was there for every step of my investigation, every lead I followed, every connection I made. He knew about it all because I told him. Carlos slammed his fist against the workbench, sending wrenches scattering. Christ, I probably got those men killed by being so goddamn trusting. Maria stood slowly, her face pale but determined. Stop. Right now. Her prosecutor's voice, the one that had intimidated drug dealers and cartel lawyers. You were 28 years old, working with a decorated supervisor you had no reason to distrust. Tommy played a 30-year game, and you weren't the only one who fell for it. But Carlos was already moving toward the lockbox, his hands working with automatic precision. The 3 passports, the foreign currency, the tools of a man who'd spent decades ready to run. Only now he understood why he'd never felt safe, why he'd always been looking over his shoulder. It wasn't paranoia, it was Tommy's invisible leash, keeping him close enough to watch, far enough away to be harmless. What are you doing? What I should have done 30 years ago. Carlos selected the passport with the most stamps, the one that would raise the fewest questions at customs. I'm going to Colombia. Dad, this is obviously a trap. If Tommy's behind Sofia's kidnapping, then sending you to Medellin plays directly into his hands. Carlos looked at his daughter, really looked at her for the first time since she'd walked into his shop. Elena's eyes, Elena's stubborn chin, but something harder around the edges. The kind of hardness that came from prosecuting monsters for a living. Maybe, he said quietly, but Sofia's still a 5-year-old girl who didn't ask to be part of this. And maybe it's time Tommy's game finally had some consequences. Maria was quiet for a moment, studying the evidence spread across the floor. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of someone making a decision that would change everything. The Cain investigation files. Everything I've been working on for the past 6 months. She pulled out her phone, fingers flying across the screen. I'm sending copies to 3 different federal prosecutors. If something happens to us, at least the evidence survives. Us? You think I'm letting you walk into this alone? Maria's smile was grim. I've spent 2 years building a case against what I thought was Cain's operation. Turns out I've been inadvertently investigating Tommy Vega. Time to finish the job. The desert wind had picked up outside, whistling through gaps in the shop's metal siding. It sounded like voices, 11 men calling across 30 years of silence, demanding justice that had never come. Carlos felt something shifting inside him, the coward's careful calculations giving way to something sharper, more dangerous. Tommy had been wrong about one thing. Carlos Mendoza wasn't the broken-down mechanic he appeared to be. 30 years of exile hadn't killed the operative, it had just taught him patience. And now, with his granddaughter's life hanging in the balance and the truth finally revealed, that patience was at an end. The hunt was about to begin. Chapter 8, Climax. The desert dawn came like a blade across the horizon, casting long shadows through the shop's grimy windows. Carlos had spent the night memorizing faces from old files, 11 men who died believing their mission mattered, whose children grew up with manufactured hero stories. Now, as Maria finalized their travel arrangements, those faces seemed to watch him from every corner of the garage. His phone buzzed. Tommy's number. Carlos. Brother, I just heard about Sofia. Jesus, I'm so sorry. The voice carried 30 years of practiced concern, but Carlos could hear the subtle probing beneath it. Tell me you're not doing anything stupid. Like what? Carlos kept his voice steady, letting Tommy fill the silence. Like believing some cartel psycho who claims to know about ancient history. A pause, carefully calculated. I've been making calls, Carlos. This Javier Restrepo, he's connected to some very dangerous people. Whatever he's told you about Comuna 13, about Cain, it's bullshit designed to get under your skin. Carlos looked at Maria, who was listening to every word through the speaker. Her prosecutor's instincts had kicked in fully now. She was taking notes, documenting lies in real time. Funny thing about ancient history, Carlos said. Sometimes new evidence surfaces. The silence stretched too long. When Tommy spoke again, his voice had lost its warmth. What kind of evidence? The kind that shows Cain wasn't working alone that night. The kind that explains how a 19-year-old translator knew exactly where to find me after the massacre. Carlos felt 30 years of manipulation crystallizing into perfect clarity. The kind that makes me wonder why my old partner showed up in Guatemala just as I was getting close to MS-13's financial networks. Carlos, you're not thinking straight. Grief makes people... I'm thinking clearer than I have in 30 years. Carlos stood, pacing the length of his shop like a caged animal. Tell me about the surveillance photos, Tommy. The ones showing Cain meeting with associates 6 months after I supposedly started investigating him. The silence this time was absolute. You know what your mistake was? Carlos continued, feeling something cold and precise sliding into place where the guilt used to live. You made me feel guilty for surviving. Let me carry the weight of 11 deaths while you built an empire on their blood. When Tommy spoke again, the mask was finally off. Those men were dead the moment they walked into that compound. I just made sure their death served a purpose. And what purpose was that? Building something bigger than the DEA's bureaucratic fumbling. $43 million buys a lot of justice, Carlos. Real justice, not the paper-pushing bullshit we were trained to do. Tommy's voice carried the fervor of a true believer. You think Cain was the only corrupt agent? The only one selling information to cartels? I built a network that actually works. Maria was recording now, her phone capturing every word of Tommy's confession. By murdering federal agents? By being smart enough to see the big picture. Cain was getting sloppy, asking questions about operational funds. Your daughter was following money trails that threatened everything we'd built. The pronoun choice was deliberate, Carlos realized. Tommy still thought he could be brought back into the fold. This could have been clean, brother. Javier takes care of loose ends. You disappear to some beach in Thailand, and the work continues. The work. Carlos tasted bile. Is that what you call kidnapping a 5-year-old? I call it solving problems before they become bigger problems. Tommy's voice was matter-of-fact, businesslike. Sophia's safe. Maria drops the Cain investigation. You go back to fixing cars. Everyone wins. Except the 11 families who never learned the truth about how their men died. The truth? Tommy laughed, but it held no warmth. The truth is that those men died because they trusted the system, because they believed in justice and duty and all the other fairy tales we were taught at Quantico. I gave their deaths meaning. Carlos felt his daughter's eyes on him, waiting to see what 30 years of running had built inside him. The old Carlos would have calculated odds, looked for angles, found a way to negotiate. But the old Carlos had been Tommy's creation, shaped by guilt and manipulation into something controllable. I'm coming for my granddaughter, Carlos said quietly. And when I find her, I'm going to make sure the whole world knows what happened in Comuna 13. No, Carlos, you're not. The words carried absolute certainty. Because if you board that plane to Medellin, if you try to play hero after 30 years of cowardice, I'll make sure Sophia disappears permanently. Not killed, that would be merciful. Just gone. Another statistic in Colombia's missing children reports. The line went dead, leaving Carlos staring at a phone that had just delivered a death sentence disguised as a threat. Maria was already moving, grabbing files, checking their weapons permits. Her prosecutor's mind shifting into combat mode. He doesn't know about the recordings. doesn't know we've documented everything. Carlos felt something settling into his bones. Not rage, not guilt, but purpose. Tommy had made one fatal mistake in 30 years of perfect manipulation. He'd forgotten that wolves, when cornered, don't negotiate. They hunt. Chapter 9, Resolution. 3 months later, Carlos stood in the same spot where the phone call had changed everything, but the auto shop felt different now, lighter somehow, as if 30 years of ghosts had finally been laid to rest. Sunlight streamed through windows he'd actually bothered to clean, illuminating a workbench that held more than just tools. A framed photograph of Sofia, safe in Maria's arms outside the Bogota courthouse where Tommy's extradition hearing had concluded. A letter from the widow of Agent Martinez, thanking him for finally bringing her husband's killer to justice. A small wooden cross that Javier Restrepo had carved during his own testimony, given as a gift between old wolves who had found their way home. The newspapers called it the largest corruption case in DEA history. $43 million, 11 murdered agents, and a 30-year conspiracy that had reached into the highest levels of federal law enforcement. Tommy Vega would spend what remained of his life in a Colombian maximum security prison. His empire of carefully constructed lies collapsed into evidence boxes and court transcripts. But Carlos wasn't reading the newspapers anymore. He was fixing Mrs. Henderson's transmission, the same work he'd been doing for 15 years, only now his hands weren't shaking. The shop's radio crackled with a Spanish-language news report. Something about new arrests in the Medellin cartel networks. Carlos understood enough to know that Javier's information had sparked a broader investigation, old wounds finally being reopened and properly cleaned. Justice moved slowly, but it moved. "Dad?" Maria's voice from the doorway, accompanied by the sound of small running feet. Sofia burst into the shop like a tiny hurricane, her school backpack bouncing as she launched herself into Carlos's arms. "Abuelo, look what I drew!" She thrust a crayon drawing toward him, a family standing in front of what might have been his garage, stick figures holding hands under a yellow sun. "It's beautiful, mija." He studied the drawing with the seriousness it deserved. "Who's this one?" He pointed to a figure standing slightly apart from the group. "That's Uncle Miguel." Sofia's matter-of-fact tone carried the easy acceptance of childhood. "Mama said he can't visit yet, but maybe someday." Maria caught Carlos's eye over their daughter's head. Miguel Santos, one of the 3 surviving agents from the original Comuna 13 team, found alive in a Mexico City safe house after Tommy's network unraveled. 30 years of believing he was the only survivor, when 2 others had been living under assumed names, too afraid to surface until the truth came out. The reunion had been scheduled for next month, when Miguel felt ready to return to the world. "Maybe someday," Carlos agreed, his voice steady. "Some wounds needed more time to heal." Later, after Sofia had convinced him to let her help organize his tools according to her own mysterious logic, Carlos found himself standing in the doorway as the sun began its descent toward the desert mountains. The same view he'd watched for 15 years, but seen now through different eyes. Eyes that no longer searched the horizon for threats that would never come. Maria joined him, wiping grease from her hands with one of his shop rags. She'd been learning to change oil, claiming she was tired of paying other mechanics when she had a perfectly good father with a garage. "Any regrets?" she asked. Carlos considered the question seriously. He could have said yes, regretted the lost years, the relationships damaged by secrets, the granddaughter who'd grown up not knowing him. Could have focused on the price of 30 years spent running from shadows that turned out to be puppets on strings. Instead, he thought about the letter from Elena's sister in Mexico, who'd reached out after seeing the news coverage. About the invitation to Sofia's upcoming school play, where she would be playing a tree and had insisted he needed to be there to see her branches. About the simple pleasure of sleeping through the night without listening for footsteps that would never come. "No," he said finally, "no regrets." The desert wind still carried voices sometimes, but now they weren't calling for justice or revenge. They were calling him home, to this place he'd built without realizing it, to this family that had found him despite everything he'd done to stay hidden. The ghosts of Comuna 13 could rest now, their story finally told, their killer finally caught. Carlos El Lobo Mendoza had spent 30 years learning to run. Now, at 58, Standing in the doorway of his garage with his daughter's laughter echoing behind him and his granddaughter's drawing tucked carefully in his shirt pocket, he was finally learning something harder. He was learning to stay. The sun touched the mountains, painting the desert gold, and somewhere in the distance wolves howled, not in warning but in welcome.